It's commonly understood that the 2014 Carmilla web series is the first adaptation by people in the LGBT community, with lesbian writers, queer actors, and a gay male director. However, that is a misconception. In 1970, two gay men, romantic partners Wilford Leach and John Braswell, wrote and directed a Carmilla chamber opera, centering on the premise that Laura might be insane and hallucinating the entire experience, but also may have psychic powers and be able to perceive things that other mortals cannot, in a probable derivation from Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. In the depths of ambiguity, they were able to insert a sympathetic portrayal of Laura as a lesbian girl longing for a female lover and conjuring up visions of Carmilla. Maybe. Without attracting scorn in a more homophobic world, and having Laura display some measure of agency in contrast to the original book. Though I never saw a performance, I have done my best to piece together what a performance would have looked like. Join me as I explore this underappreciated adaptation to the stage called Carmilla, a Vampire Tale.
A phantasmagoria, surrounded by darkness. I slept in a room in the upper story with no stable roof. I can't have been more than 6 years old.
In 1961, a black woman named Ellen Stewart, known to her friends as Mama, made a deal with her white Jewish friend, playwright Paul Foster. If they combined their funds and acquired a small building in New York City's Lower East Side, they would share the space for their business endeavors and help each other develop their businesses. Stewart would use the top part of the building to run a fashion boutique, and Foster would use the basement as a theater. In honor of her, he named his theater Café La Mama. Café La Mama would be a haven for marginalized storytellers, gay people, trans people, and people of color, to experiment without being held to the standards of Broadway, or even off-Broadway, developing a style now called off-Broadway. Following the deal, Foster helped Stewart build up her fashion boutique, and she helped him develop Café La Mama. However, she came to like working on the theater more than the fashion boutique, closed the latter, and became a full-time producer for Café La Mama, eventually taking over the theater named after her. A theater needs a resident acting troupe, so Foster and Stewart retained a local troupe called the Experimental Theater Club Company, aka the ETC Company, run by life partners Wilford Leach and John Braswell, who also co-ran the drama program at Sarah Lawrence. Café La Mama was successful enough that Stewart and Foster were able to move it to a bigger location in the East Village and change the name to La Mama, where it and the ETC Company remain to this day. In 1970, Stewart produced a single-act chamber opera adapting Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla to the stage. Carmilla, a Vampire Tale, written and directed by Leach, co-directed by Braswell, who also served as the art director, with music by Ben Johnston. About 90 minutes long and composed of 13 scenes, it used innovative storytelling techniques incorporating video footage into a stage performance. Though commonplace today, this was virtually never seen in American theater before Leach came up with it. The opera proved to be a big hit for La Mama, and came back in 1971, 1972, 1973, 1976, 1986, and 2003, but has been dormant ever since. The ETC Company released a cast recording from 1972 on long play record. La Mama released numerous photos and recordings to a college library, and posted scans and photos of this content on their website. And I was able to purchase copies of notes that Johnston wrote. I also read reviews from theater critics published in contemporary newspapers, some of which La Mama posted, and some of which I accessed through newspaper digital databases. Thanks to these, I've mostly been able to piece together what a performance would have looked like. Laura was played by Margaret Benzak, and Carmilla was first played by Nancy Hyken, and Sandra Johnson took over the role of Carmilla in 1972, before Hyken reacquired the role in 1976. Benzak's appearance worked well originally, was acceptable in 1986, and looked bizarrely old by 2003. Hyken ages too, but it's arguably worse with Benzak. First, she was less made up for Laura. Second, a vampire looking old while supposed to be 18 adds to the thematic age discordance, as with certain shots in Let the Right One In. To achieve the vampire look, Hyken and Johnson were covered in white makeup and had their mouths highlighted with dark red lipstick, giving Carmilla a classic gothic appearance that isn't used that much in modern vampire stories. It does a lot to communicate that she isn't quite human. The set was minimalistic, centering a large red couch, custom-made for the opera, with carvings of human faces represented by a chorus of actors wearing brown makeup to look like wood. According to Johnston's notes, the bench, of course, symbolizes the confinement of the physical, social, and psychological environment. The backdrop was the only part of the set that changed. The backdrop was a dynamic movie screen onto which different things were projected. Sometimes it was a title card reading Carmilla, a title card containing edited text from the novella to info dump exposition, wallpaper representing the interior of Laura's room, the exterior of her schloss, the woods, drawings, or playing video representing things occurring in Laura's consciousness, which are either offstage objective events or things that she imagines or remembers. The video segments were directed by Jack Coddington, who would also create video footage for a play called Murderous Angels in 1971. Drawing from Carmilla's example. Johnston notes, "This is quintessentially a collaborative artwork. The libretto delineates plot and dialogue, the music contributes the emotional context and some descriptive elements, and the slides provide poetic commentary. The orchestra would be half visible, standing off to the side of the stage, dressed in black and mostly hidden in the shadow, effectively ornamenting the stage in much the same way that the chorus did. The sound speakers would be placed on the opposite side of the stage. The main actors not part of the set dressings were the two stars. Hyken had a knee injury preventing her from doing much more than sit on the couch beside Benzak, but that would have been appropriate to the languid character of Carmilla, and it seems to have informed Johnson's performance as well. The mountebank, the hunchback charlatan, was represented by an actor who went on stage in a single scene, and the mysterious woman, in the role of Carmilla's mother, was a dual role played by the same actress who played Madame Perrodon, while Laura's father, Madame Perrodon, and Mademoiselle de la Fontaine were portrayed by the actors playing the carvings on the sofa. This, and a heavy use of shadows separating the mountebank from the rest of the stage, gave every character but Laura and Carmilla a sense of not truly existing outside of Laura's head, and the audience wasn't sure about Carmilla either. The wooden faces particularly remind me of the gargoyles in Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, where they're active characters from Quasimodo's perspective, but appear inanimate when Esmeralda is in the room, making it appear like it's all in his head, but with a layer of ambiguity. The faces are an interesting idea, but perhaps poorly executed given the brown makeup's similarity to blackface. Personally, I would have used a white oak couch instead of mahogany. La Mama has a particular style of performance based in rhythmic gesticulations and other body movements set to a backdrop of evocative music and visuals. It was inspired by acting methods from different Asian countries, including India, Japan, and Korea, specifically because Stewart wanted to cultivate a style of marginalized ethnicities whose cultural influences wouldn't be seen in mainstream American theater, though she also wanted to pay homage to ancient Greek dramas that emphasized physical expression over talking. Show, don't tell. Laura and Carmilla can be seen gesticulating in some of the recorded photographs, but there's only so much they could do while sitting on a couch, a detail that multiple reviewers complained about at the time. The faces likewise appear to have been as emotionally evocative as they could without their bodies showing, actively reacting to the occurrences of a number of scenes. It would have been a good exercise for mime actors. It's possible that the faces could have illustrated Laura's emotional state within the ambiguous framing where they might be hallucinations. The genre is that of a psychological thriller, with a general surreal tone and ambiguous plot elements, leading the audience to question how much is real. While almost every beat of the plot comes straight from the novella, the framing appears to draw heavily from Shirley Jackson's 1959 novel The Haunting of Hill House, about a lesbian-coded, possibly mentally ill, possibly psychic, young woman whose fate is bound up in a possibly haunted, possibly just creepy, old dark house. This was adapted to film in 1963's The Haunting, with its lesbian ambiguity intact, and has inspired horror writers ever since. Though we may recoil in the modern day at the thought of gay people being framed as mentally ill, this theme of ambiguity under the framing of mental illness allowed for some more overt gay representation than would have otherwise been socially acceptable at the time. In 1970, gay people weren't just ostracized. Homosexual activity was an actual crime and one associated with pedophilia. The general public wanted the police to crack down on gay people, to root them out from where they were hiding, and send them off to prison whenever they were caught trying to, have consensual sex with adult members of the same gender. While Braswell was brave enough to be out as a form of activism, Leach was closeted for a fear of persecution. Gay and straight ally creators often hid their positive stories in homophobic storytelling conventions purely out of necessity.
Call it my woman's intuition, if you will.
They had to frame everything as morally wrong, against normative values, such as depicting gay people as literal Nazis, as was a common device in early queer cinema, or clinically insane, but they tried to insert moderate positivity into the depictions as they could. The idea of reclaiming insanity as something fun and subversive was also popular at the time, with Buddy Holly's 1958 hit song Rave On. Embracing the label of insanity, leveled at dance culture, ultimately inspiring people to literally call their dance parties raves. Leach was probably feeling particularly subversive at the time that he wrote the opera, in late 1969, because he lived in New York City during the Stonewall riots earlier that year. Queer people were tired of being demonized and arrested just for consensual sexual activity and gender expression, and they decided to band together and show their anger as an organized force. This was in reflection of the civil rights riots occurring as a response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Of course, all of this was exacerbated by the continual protests against the Vietnam War. Everyone was rising up and showing their discontent at the cruel, oppressive establishment. In this environment, Leach decided to adapt a horror story about lesbianism with the framing device of insanity, with which we can imagine he would have used to allow for ambiguous positivity. Similar to the protagonist of Haunting of Hill House, Laura here is framed as a possibly mentally ill, possibly psychic, possibly haunted, lesbian-coded girl who enters into an emotional relationship with a dominant lesbian-coded girl whose possible predatory attraction may lead her to siphon life from her, and Laura is sent spiraling down a dark path by these ambiguous events. In the novella, Carmilla, who is explicitly a murderous vampire, bites Laura at 6 years old, is warded off by the Lord's Prayer, and then comes back 12 years later. Upon seeing Carmilla, Laura immediately recognizes her as the nightmarish figure who attacked her, and Carmilla spins a story about also recognizing Laura because she had pretty much the same quote-unquote dream as Laura at 6 years old, seeing Laura as she appears now. Carmilla convinces Laura that they each had visions of the other, but this is almost certainly a misdirect to confuse her, and the reader, when there is actually a straightforward vampire predation taking place. However, the opera never makes it clear if this is a misdirect, or if Laura truly had a vision. Though the plot was designed to be extremely ambiguous, and succeeded at confusing a number of reviewers, Johnston's notes make it clear that his version of Laura indeed has psychic powers. The implications of this are also ambiguous. I think it's suggested that Carmilla might never show up at all, and that Laura is either imagining or having vision nightmares or psychic communions with the spirit of Countess Mircalla Karnstein, who died long ago and did not come back as a vampire, which is an interesting idea that Johnston's notes indicate isn't true. Carmilla the vampire is literally there, and Laura has visions around her. This was not clear at all to the people watching the play. It could also be that all of that is true within a hallucination. It's all very ambiguous. Similar to the novella, the lesbian aspect of the plot is communicated through vibe, more than explicit sexual behavior, playing out on the stage. Most reviews of the opera only hint at it in euphemism, calling it sensual, psychosexual, or Freudian. That's the guarded way of saying sexual tension you can cut with a knife. One reviewer was bold enough to describe a hint of lesbianism. Meanwhile, Michael Feingold, a critic known for being blunt, just out and out called them gay women, and critiqued the portrayal of homosexuality in the context of the Stonewall riots. My kind of guy. It is interesting that the opera's release coincided with the 1970 Hammer horror film adaptation The Vampire Lovers, which was allowed to get extremely overt with lesbian imagery, just so long as the production claimed pure ignorance of lesbian subtext. Lead actress Ingrid Pitt put on this whole bimbo routine, like, oh, that's so silly. Vampires aren't lesbians. As with Vampire Lovers, the opera retains the original framing of Carmilla as a predatory lesbian, stalking innocent Laura, at least in its main interpretation. However, it does have some element of agency, at least at the end, and it seems a lot prettier than Hammer's blunt, rape as sexual entertainment imagery. With the haunting music, it strikes me as a lovely horror story, similar to the 2011 Carmilla-inspired film The Moth Diaries. LA Times reviewer Dan Sullivan described the play as an exquisite study of love as defined by the spider, while Hammer's creative thought process was clearly, hey, social restrictions have relaxed enough for us to get away with some lesbian imagery, so let's make something to really appeal to horny teenage boys in the audience. Leach appears to have thought, hey, social restrictions have relaxed enough to get away with some lesbian imagery, so let's really explore the concept of a lesbian vampire in this classic novella as much as we can. Born in 1929, Wilfrid Leach was known as a genius theater director who won several awards in the course of his life. He was a professor at Sarah Lawrence and taught a drama program there along with his romantic partner, John Braswell, with whom he also co-founded the ETC Theater Company. He was proficient in set design and art direction, and he worked primarily as an art director during his time at La Mama. He directed several plays there and at other theaters, directed a Tony Award-winning revival of The Pirates of Penzance in 1980, went on to make a film version in 1983 with most of the same cast, and won another Tony Award with a 1986 production of The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Brian De Palma's 1974 musical film, The Phantom of the Paradise, pays homage to Leach, with its protagonist being named Winslow Leach. Unfortunately, like many gay men to live through that era, Leach contracted HIV and developed AIDS. He died in 1988 from stomach cancer related to the condition, at the age of 59. There was initial resistance to referring to him as a gay victim of the HIV epidemic, respecting his preference to remain closeted. But La Mama eventually noted his romantic relationship to Braswell once the stigma died down some years later. John Braswell was born in 1938. He developed a love of theater at school and went on to study it at Sarah Lawrence at a time when the only men who could enroll were veterans and theater students. He and his partner went on to run the drama program there. Though Leach was in the closet, Braswell was an out and proud gay man, open about his orientation to his students and colleagues. He co-founded the ETC Company, and he directed several plays with La Mama, as well as acted in their and other theaters' productions. I was unable to find a photo of John Braswell, but the cast recording does have audio of him. Unfortunately, at the time he was doing a funny voice, so we don't have him speaking naturally.
Oh, ladies both, greetings, I greet you at your window.
Like Leach, he contracted HIV, but was open about it as a form of activism, challenging the stigma. He developed AIDS and died in 1989. A year after his partner, at age 51. The music was written by Ben Johnston, a prolific musical composer known for extending a type of staff notation that was first put forward by music theorist Harry Partch. In 1990, John Rockwell called him one of the best non-famous composers this country has to offer. Johnston had an eclectic style and was fond of pushing the envelope by using notes uncommonly used by American musicians. For Carmilla, he used a rock opera style evocative of Les Miserables. In his book, Maximum Clarity and Other Writings on Music, Johnston describes the music he wrote for Carmilla. I proposed to Leach that the music be composed of every degree of tonal organization, from musique concrète, music composed of recorded sounds, shading into literal sound effects, through non-pitch percussion, to conventionally tuned instrumental music, and just tuned microtonal instrumental music, held together by a microtonally tuned piano. He wanted the audience to both hum the music when they left, and hate themselves for doing so. It is both catchy and haunting, with wild divergences in genre and volume, to effectively communicate the characters' often turbulent emotions. Thanks to the public domain, most of the lyrics are lifted straight from the novella, and provided by Leach. Unfortunately, the lyrics incorporate quotes from the novella in a way that's often a bit unwieldy, with long stretches of prose that the music seems to pause for, while the vocals catch up. Johnston died in 2019 from complications related to Parkinson's disease at the age of 93. The play begins with a bit of humor as Laura sits alone on the couch and Sing narrates about her and her father being English people living in Austria, in the middle of nowhere. Why? Because everything is so cheap!
Everything is marvelously cheap.
This, of course, is the sentiment expressed in the first sentence of the novella, so it is something that Le Fanu wanted the reader to bear in mind when appreciating Laura as a character. She's a rich girl, but kind of a stingy rich girl. The fact that this play emphasizes this detail makes it a bit closer to the novella than most adaptations bother with, at least in this respect. The first song is bright and cheerful with trumpets and captures the spirit of how fun it is for Laura to live here in picturesque Styria, while at the same time being ethereal and weird as a hint of things to come. The chorus actors keep their eyes closed for the scene, and the lighting makes it so the audience doesn't realize they're even there.
My father, the kindest man on earth, but growing old.
In the book, this is a bit of a throwaway line, just to paint a general picture, but the song emphasizes it. We're now thinking about Laura being isolated, and perhaps the intimidation of someone approaching death. Fear of death is present in the book, of course, but the opera draws it out into a strong theme. The melody takes a disturbing turn as Laura describes a formative dream that she had at 6 years old when Carmilla showed up, bit her, and left. Wham bam thank you, ma'am. This exposition would have been painted by Laura without Carmilla visible to the audience, perhaps making us wonder how much is real. The song's rhythm controls the emotional tone, with Laura's pace starting out smooth and slow, but getting faster as she gets increasingly nervous as she thinks about Carmilla approaching. It's a very effective technique. She describes screaming, Carmilla running off, and her father comforting her, getting priests to sing hymns. And now she's 18. The lyrics make a point of establishing the timeline. This happened when she was 6. Now she's 18. Considering that the original novella stated these details inconsistently and gave Laura conflicting ages, I can imagine Leach wanting to make note of what timeline they were going for, and the lyrics being based off of these notes, with the result that the timeline is now strongly communicated to the audience when it might not totally need to be.
I can't have been more than 6 years old. I can't have been more than 6 years old. Been more than 6 years old. Now I am 18.
She's 18 now. She was 6 when this all happened, but she's 18 now. Got that? Got that? Good. Throughout the play, reality is uncertain. We see the world through Laura's eyes, and she might be crazy or having visions that don't represent her physical reality. It's unclear if Carmilla's visit to her at 6 happened at all. It's all framed ambiguously, though Johnston's notes do indicate that Laura had a vision of Carmilla that had physical properties. Regardless of what actually happened, the audience is left tense. The next part is peaceful, but we're just waiting for it to get scary again. The second scene is not included in the cast recording. In this scene, the chorus actors open up their eyes and surprise the audience. They then sing background information about the local vampire folklore, based on the scene in the book where they all stroll by a river. It's a very small detail there, but Laura presumably swam in this river before, to which she compares the sensation of having blood sucked from her veins. In the opera, the river is replaced with a lake reflecting the moonlight. The moon is significant in two ways. One, as a reference to an outdated pseudoscience called odic force, which affects dreams, lunacy, and nervous people, as is connected to Laura's apparent insanity in Dream of Carmilla. And two, as an outdated vampire trope that has mostly been displaced by the association with werewolves, started by Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 1943. Now, the moon as a thematic element in itself, and not just a background detail, is definitely there in the novella, but it's not significant enough for most adaptations to feature, especially with such a strong focus as this opera. Why Leach chose to focus on it probably has to do with something else that happened in 1969.
We went to the moon in 1969.
America beat Russia in the space race and landed on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
What once was a background detail was elevated into a national character. America kind of went moon crazy, and it wound up as a character of sorts in this Carmilla adaptation. The still lake reflecting the moon is now used as a metaphor for eerie hidden layers beneath the surface. What we think of as mundane life has more going on, and it's connected to the moon. Johnston's notes describe the music as slow and hypnotic. The lyrics muse on how the lake is much more dangerous than first apparent, before moving onward into the local folklore. The repeated line, "When the moon shines like that," precedes a short, scary story. While the book only gives a few concrete examples of what the moon does, gives a man a stroke, perceived as a spiritual attack, makes windows light up like they're to receive fairy guests, and brings Carmilla, the opera lyrics give us several new ones. The moon triggers fish predation, shipwrecks, sudden currents that make people drown, horrible nightmares, dog aggression, suicide, and aggression from crazy people in asylums, who scream so loud that nurses stuff cotton in their ears, in what may be an allusion to Odysseus protecting himself from sirens. One of the La Mama programs advertising the opera used an image of a hydra to represent Carmilla, so it's possible that Leach was inspired by Greek mythology.
Hail Hydra.
Several of these lyrics function as foreshadowing. Johnston's notes indicate that the lyrics referencing suicide are to be sung with intensity. This is an important part of the song. It is relevant to the theme about the dual attraction and repulsion of death, and has particular relevance to the final scenes of the opera. Though the more aquatic lyrics are more just atmospheric, the predation element alludes to Carmilla's vampiric activities. The nightmares allude to Laura's horrific vision of Carmilla, and her later predation that Laura mistakes for a nightmare. In the novella, the mountebank has a dog that flips out in Carmilla's presence. It's possible that this was originally intended to be included in the play, but ultimately was not. Both Laura and Carmilla are suggested to be crazy, and Carmilla's seduction of Laura resembles a siren song. You know, it's weird that these programs never used the image of a siren to represent Carmilla. Just the Hydra, a bunch of imps, Medusa, some vague occult-like symbols, and these weird snail bros. The pacing soon picks up when the people of the house catch sight of a carriage running past in a hurry. Maybe. It's suggested that it could be a hallucination, though the notes indicate that it is supposed to be real. It's represented by a video playing on the backdrop. The song describing the scene is fast-paced, with a rhythm that's reminiscent of running horses.
Listen, a sound of carriage wheels and hoofs upon the road, approaching from the high ground, overlooking the bridge. Then in the moonlight, two horsemen, now a carriage drawn by four horses.
It reminds me of the Bad Horse theme from Dr. Horrible.
He rides across the nation, the thoroughbred of sin. He got the application that you just sent in.
Of course, the carriage crashes, and the music gains an exciting cinematic quality.
There were two horses on the ground, the carriage lay upon its side.
illustrated through the backdrop. I'm curious how Coddington pulled off this part. It seems like the special effect would require a bigger budget than this kind of production probably had. Maybe Stewart was just really good with getting investors, and we actually saw a carriage crash, or maybe the camera just jerked around a bit and got blurry. As in the novella, the sinister character presenting as Carmilla's mother, here called the Mysterious Woman, makes a fuss about needing to go, and her poor daughter needing to be left somewhere. Her ranting marks the first use of the name Carmilla, and it is said heavily, with great significance.
How far to the nearest inn? I must leave her there, leave Carmilla there, and shall not see my dear, nor even hear of her, not see nor hear of my daughter until my return 3 months hence.
Laura's father is tricked into having the idea that she could stay at the Schloss with them, invites her,
and there was much rejoicing.
Notably, Matska, the racist black caricature, isn't there. Maybe Stewart had an issue with it, but it's weird that she wouldn't also have an issue with the brown makeup. Whether Matska was cut out to make the narrative less racist, or just to streamline it, isn't clear, but I'm glad that she's gone. If you can't go with full-blown racial progressivism like the web series does, it's best to trim the fat. Carmilla enters from the side of the stage, passing under a curtain, and joining Laura on the couch. When Laura sees Carmilla, she recognizes her as her supposed nightmare and recoils. Carmilla says she recognizes Laura from a similar dream and sings a song about them being soulmates.
I must tell you my dream, it is so strange. How could it be that you and I should have had so vivid a dream? Each of the other, so vivid a dream. How could it be that we should have seen I, you, and you, me, looking as you do now?
They don't explicitly use romantic language, but it has the tone of a meet-cute from a romantic comedy. And Carmilla is persuasive enough to get Laura thinking that this is what's going on. This is presented as possibly a misdirect from a literal vampire, but it's unclear to the audience. Johnston's notes reveal that Carmilla is actually telling the truth, creating an air of ambiguity. It's an effective use of a disturbing element in a horror story, and very queer, in a way parallel with the novella. Now that Laura and Carmilla are friends, they hang out and Carmilla tries to woo her. Laura comments that it's like the night that Carmilla came to them, which implies the presence of the moon and all its odic power. Laura pesters Carmilla to tell her where she came from and the details of her life, but Carmilla refuses. Off Laura's reaction, Carmilla asks if Laura feels insulted. She says no, but that Carmilla has now failed a test to see if they're truly friends. Carmilla argues that Laura's test can't accurately measure love, breaking into a rock song about how Carmilla may not be Laura's friend, but she is someone who loves Laura. Friends may have no secrets, but lovers have plenty of secrets. Love is about shadow and mystery, lack of restraint and danger.
Love is full of hidden corners and closed doors, of the unspoken and of paradox. So it is that as you feel in your love, and you shall die, die sweetly, die.
It's essentially a line from Spike in Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Trust is for old marrieds, Buffy. Great love is wild and passionate and dangerous. It burns and consumes.
He literally sexually assaults her a moment later. Take vampire dating advice with a grain of salt. Unlike vampire lovers keeping Carmilla pleasant, this Carmilla sounds kind of mean and prickly, but sympathetic. She has more character than in Vampire Lovers. You get the sense of a long-lived, possible vampire who has selfish desires and an active thought process musing on things, like how love is a cruel paradox.
What is love? A smile is a snarl domesticate, and a kiss an unfulfilled fight, and love is a cruel paradox.
Now in the book, that's how Laura describes her conflicted feelings toward Carmilla. Here, Carmilla is totally conscious that she has that effect on Laura, and describes it as the essence of love. Laura expresses discomfort with Carmilla when she's in these moods. Overt sexual dominance. Carmilla tells Laura to put her hand to her throat, on her pulse point, and prompts her to explain that her heart is beating faster with both pleasure and fear at the same time. What is implicit in the book is explicit here. Laura is turned on by Carmilla's sexual dominance and is afraid, and perhaps is turned on because she's afraid. Love is a paradox. Before things can get too out of hand, Carmilla seemingly decides to pretend that she was just briefly overcome by a moment of insanity. Acts like she's snapping out of it, remarks that she must have dozed off and had a strange dream. Did Laura also have a strange dream? This is almost certainly Carmilla gaslighting Laura for the sake of creepy stalker seduction, making her confused about what's real and what's not, but it also increases the ambiguity of the scene. From the audience's perspective, Laura could have just hallucinated everything. The implied presence of the moon is thematic of this strange experience. It could have made Carmilla crazy. It could have made Laura crazy. It could have given either or both of them strange dreams. I think the actual thing it does is energize Carmilla. It makes her belt out sexy rock songs, with lines like, "A kiss is an unfulfilled bite." Thanks, Moon! One afternoon, they hang out under a grove when a funeral procession goes by, mourning a girl who died suddenly after reporting seeing a ghost visiting her at night. In the novella, she reports a ghost, but it's clear that Carmilla ate her as a hungry vampire. Here it's presented more ambiguously. At least from the audience's perspective, Carmilla could be a ghost and not a vampire. Laura joins in singing a hymn, annoying Carmilla, who starts ranting about how mourning death is bad, when it's inevitable and ultimately desirable.
I hate funerals. Hate them. Hate, 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 hate them! What a fuss! Why, you must die. Everyone must die. And all are happier when they do.
The way the volume can suddenly ramp up is interesting. It's not something that one typically hears in modern music, and it commands the emotions of the listener, as I imagine it commanded the audience. When Laura raises her voice, it's in fear. When Carmilla raises hers, it's in anger. Her anger is a queer element, distinguishing her from Laura's traditional femininity, and giving her a range of expression equivalent to that of a man in a traditional patriarchal environment, where of course she comes from. Also, it's scary. We mustn't forget that. It reminds me of the 2008 Japanese horror audio drama Yandere no Onna no Ko, Stalker Girls, where the stalker girls transition from sweet and demure to loud and aggressive in a heartbeat.
それにしてもしつこかったな。いくらすばしっこくても、私のテリトリーで勝てるわけないのにね。さしても反撃してきやがって。だから聞き分けのないガキは嫌いなのよ。
Carmilla-san wa yandere desu. During the height of the hymn, Carmilla seems especially distressed and begs Laura to squeeze her hand tightly.
I'll have what she's having.
Carmilla muses about how people are afraid to die, even though they would be better off dying, apparently conflicted about her nature as an undead fiend, but concludes that it would be great to die together with Laura, as lovers may, as in they would both be vampires, but also have sex together. The mountebank comes in a comedic sequence that is one of the few versions of him I actually like. He's kind of an awkward element, just a weird disabled poor person to gawk at. Most adaptations cut him out entirely. The only other version I like is in the 2014 World War II centered play, and that's mainly because of the thematic depth he brings in as a scared Romani or Jewish man suffering Nazi oppression. In this version, he is genuinely funny. He's a silly old man with a funny voice who puts on a performance of him clowning around for the amusement of the rich, and is amusing to the audience the same way he is to Laura. If this is what Le Fanu intended, I finally get a sense of why he included this character to begin with. In the original production, he was played by John Braswell in a director cameo. However, the more interesting casting choice is in a few later productions, where he was played by Wallace Shawn.
Inconceivable!
And honestly, I can totally see him as the mountebank. He's got the same weaselly tone and squeaky voice,
I offer charms and yours.
especially in his role as the Grand Nagus in Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
It's like talking to a Klingon.
The comedy slips back into horror as the mountebank spots Carmilla's fangs and offers to file them down.
See here, my ladies, I profess among other things their use, the art of dentistry. Mind that, lady, your noble friend, the charming dark-haired lady on your left, has the sharpest teeth.
While there is an element of terror where we're worried for the mountebank and Laura, the swell of the music seems to capture Carmilla's alarm and terror of discovery. I imagine Carmilla looks scary here. Her reaction, to viciously threaten him, comes across as harsh, horrific, but ultimately understandable, and we are led to be sympathetic to her.
How dare that old fool insult us so? Where is your father? I will demand the wretch be tied up to the pump and flogged with a cord.
誰が怖いってねえ、誰が怖いって言うのよ
I like that degree of depth given to our villain. The audience is respected for knowing Carmilla is a vampire, without playing up the mystery that the novella is framed in, and this allows for a framing that gets inside her head a bit. Even if we don't necessarily want her to succeed as an evil vampire, we can still respect her as a lonely lesbian girl herself. The mountebank runs away in fear, but then laughs. I get the impression that he's used to harsh treatment. Rich people. Carmilla starts stalking Laura at her bed in disguise as a monstrous black cat, and a few other forms distinct from her usual appearance. Unlike vampire lovers, where the Laura figure knows that the spirit looks like Carmilla and is just too stupid to realize that it is her, the opera has Carmilla obscure her identity, which makes a lot more sense. I think the actress didn't do much more than sit on the couch, but she might have emoted hiding her face. A change from the novella is that the scenes are about Carmilla stalking, but not necessarily feeding, though that does happen. This allows the stalking scenes to build in intensity until we get to the biting, assuming that's actually taking place. According to Johnston, yes it is. Honestly, it's an improvement on the plot structure. Laura sets the stage in an engaging melody.
I dreamed that I was in my room and lying in my bed. I fancied I sat up. I could see the room just as I had seen it last before I fell asleep, except the candle now was out. Then, in this curious half-thought, I saw something moving round the foot of my bed. It was an animal of sooty black.
That line is said in such a distinctive way that it sticks with me most out of all the others. I can imagine theatergoers quoting it at each other as they left. That, and some of the mountebank's lines. It's not quite a quote from the book, though she did describe a sooty black animal that resembled a monstrous cat. How the cat was represented is unclear. A few promotional images show Laura and Carmilla petting a tabby house cat. Even though the color doesn't match up, it's possible that footage of this cat moving around could have been used. Or maybe the tabby was an allusion to a special effect that couldn't be used in the promotional images. Maybe a large puppet or animation. Laura describes the cat pacing back and forth, creating terrible apprehension that culminates in the monstrous humanoid figure with apparent murderous intent.
It turns into you, Carmilla.
Me. But she doesn't recognize it as Carmilla. Then Madame Peridon starts narrating, which makes no sense, giving the scene a bit of surreality, like Laura might be crazy. Carmilla bites Laura on her breast, and Laura screams, evoking the idea of the moon causing nightmares and making lunatics scream. Laura goes to tell Carmilla about her nightmare, only for Carmilla to first tell her own story about being stalked by the same figure in a twisted version of the song we just heard. She concludes by saying the charm that she bought from the mountebank warded off the figure, and Laura is left thinking that Carmilla is innocent and she just needed to have her own charm accessible. As in the book, Carmilla is quick to follow up with a claim that the charms are scientific in basis, that there are no supernatural forces at work, and that there are chemicals that affect dreams when they enter the body. In the novella, it's a sinister deflection to keep Laura from even thinking about the possibility of a vampire being afoot. In the opera, it adds a layer of ambiguity. Is Carmilla actually present? If she is she a vampire? Is everything explainable by science? Was it just a nightmare? Also, the opera adds an interesting nuance by emphasizing one line to imply that Carmilla is personally offended by the folklore about her kind.
You don't suppose that evil spirits are frightened by ribbons with markings on them, do you?
As an evil spirit myself, I would never.
Ooh, what about vampires?
No, it's not vampires.
But with all the blood, you think that makes obvious
Not
sense.
vampires. Moving on.
As Carmilla continues to harass Laura, maybe, Laura slides into a depression and starts thinking that death would be welcome, much as the moon is said to make people suicidal. As Laura gets increasingly sick, the music takes on a funerary tone. She dwells on the feeling of being fed on, making the comparison to swimming in a river. Now the local river has been adapted into a lake, but who cares? She could have swam in a different river. Her father notices that something's up, and Mademoiselle de La Fontaine advises her to close the curtains and block out the moonlight. She knows the moon energizes supernatural evil. She's like the anti-maids in Dracula who removed the garlic. Laura has vague dreams of an evil spirit stalking her. At one point, she wakes up and sees Carmilla as a distorted humanoid figure hanging from the top of her canopy bed by gnarled hands, showing her extreme strength. I get the impression that blocking the moonlight makes her less attractive, that her youthful beauty is a glamour, and without the boost of energy the moon provides, she looks like an old hag, and Laura doesn't recognize her. But this is just speculation. When Laura sees this terrifying figure hanging over her, Carmilla looks back and winks.
Something is clinging to the top of the draperies. My turned hands, feet not touching the floor. It turns toward me and winks.
That's somewhat unsettling.
In a strange twist, it turns out that Laura's father is having an affair with Mademoiselle de La Fontaine. The only real advantage to having this detail is that she presumably badgers him about Laura's illness and suggests supernatural causes. He would probably just dismiss a servant, but a servant he's sleeping with has more sway. Though he's skeptical about the supernatural, he does see that Laura's illness matches up with what the peasants attribute to an oupire. Laura tells Carmilla she had a frightening dream of a figure standing over her, covered in her blood.
Last night I dreamed I saw someone standing near the foot of my bed in a white nightdress, laid from chin to feet in one great stain of blood.
Carmilla is like, isn't that silly? Then presumably changes the subject. It culminates in an overt predatory lesbian attack, and what I'm sure was what led the reviewers to describe the play as sensual, psychosexual, Freudian, having a hint of lesbianism, or just blunt and called it about gay women. Carmilla crawls on top of Laura, kisses her, caresses her, grabs her throat, and seemingly strangles her in a sex metaphor.
My heart beats faster. My heart beats. My breathing rises and falls rapidly. Full drama, sobbing, strangulation. I cannot breathe. Dreadful convulsions.
I'll have what she's having.
After the act, Laura stares up to the canopy in horror as Carmilla hangs above her in a monster form. She's not a cat this time, but a Kafka-esque giant insect, not allowing Laura a moment to breathe. Carmilla keeps the terrifying intensity to keep Laura stuck in that state of fear-induced sexual arousal.
Trust is for old marrieds, Buffy.
Yeah, shut up. Laura sings piteously about her sufferings to Carmilla. Laura suggests that they aren't actually dreams, that an evil spirit really is harassing her, wondering aloud if it might be an oupir. And Carmilla instead puts forward that they're actually distorted visions of the past or the future, just as Laura had at 6 years old. That is an interesting idea. Laura's whole perception of Carmilla could be a vision. According to Johnston's notes, she isn't. There's a literal vampire there, stalking her, but the viewers don't know that. It's ambiguous. Carmilla draws Laura's attention away from her own troubles and onto the beautiful moonlight. Laura giggles like she's having a nervous breakdown. This scene deviates from the rest of the opera to instead deliver exposition based on the info dumps delivered by General Spielsdorf and Baron Fordenberg in the novella. In the opera, those characters are mostly cut out, and there is instead a non-diegetic series of slides projected onto the background, giving us info dumps in text, set to slow and dreamy instrumental music. In one production put on at the University of Illinois, the text was read aloud by an off-screen extra, noted to be female. As seen in a couple of photos, Carmilla flirted with Laura in silence. Johnston's notes contain the full text. I've asked my girlfriend, Miss Ink Noir, to recreate the narration.
One sign of the vampire is the power of the hand. This power is not confined to its grasp. It leaves a numbness in the limb it seizes, which is slowly, if ever, recovered from. The vampire is prone to be fascinated with an engrossing vehemence with particular persons. In these cases, it will husband and protract its enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure, and seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. Assume at starting a territory perfectly free from the pest. How does it begin? How does it multiply itself? A suicide under certain circumstances becomes a vampire. The force field of its life is not discharged as in normal death, but radiates outward through some paranormal fear, a fear of death itself. Under such circumstances, certain objects and metals may charge up as in a powerful magnetic field. Thereafter, in such a place, manifestations of these charges may be awesome and terrible, or may be relatively minor, as in those rooms, well lit, where plants turn brown, wither and die, and songbirds fail to sing. The most terrible of these charges may be so powerful as to re-energize a corpse after normal life is past. Thus it is that a suicide, disillusioned with life itself, yet terrified of the unknown, of the dark abyss that is death, lurks at the edges of life, a creature of the half-light. It knows no greater gift to offer its cherished victims than the same freedom from death that it itself has found.
This provides some interesting backstory to Carmilla. In contrast from the book, where it's implied that another lesbian vampire forcibly turned Carmilla into a vampire, this background text, read by a woman, suggests that Carmilla could have died by suicide and became a vampire at the last moment, when she was terrified of dying. This gives an interesting layer of nuance to her freaking out over funerals, and protesting that everyone is happier to die. The original book indicates that the first vampire was an evil man who committed suicide and became a vampire just because that's how it works. but this gets into greater detail about why it works like that, and cuts out the detail about it being an evil man. By implication, it's talking about Carmilla and inspires viewer sympathy. There's also an interesting edit removing details about Carmilla trying to murder Laura, and that her aggression resembles love. By implication, this version of Carmilla doesn't view turning Laura into a vampire necessarily as a murder, and can actually love her. Of course, there's also the thematic connection to the moon. As for the detail about the power of the hand, it takes on a different context here than in the book. In the book, Carmilla grabs General Spielsdorf's arm and causes permanent numbness while defending herself. In the opera, General Spielsdorf isn't really a character, so the text refers to both the added scene where Carmilla effortlessly hangs from the canopy bed, and the funeral scene where Carmilla asks Laura to squeeze her hand tightly as a means of keeping the sung hymn from affecting her. In the book it's inconsequential, but in the opera, during this exposition segment, Laura holds her hand up like there might be something wrong with it. She holds it away from her body and stares down at it. It suggests that tightly holding Carmilla's hand permanently marked her, as a means of illustrating that she now has one foot in the other world, thanks to her interaction with the vampire. One night, Carmilla shows Laura the moon, and, staring at it, starts explaining its occult significance. While Mademoiselle de La Fontaine's knowledge is grounded in Irish folktales and German pseudoscience, Carmilla references Islam, which is an interesting detail added to the character. Laura warns her not to look at the moon like that, or she might get mesmerized, which is ironic. Carmilla asks what Laura knows about mesmerism, and Laura unwittingly describes what Carmilla has been doing to her. Carmilla pauses for a moment and then corrects her. Yes, mesmerism generally works like that, but mediums, people who can channel spirits, can look at the moon and see the past and the future. Laura insists that she doesn't believe in that, which is dubious considering that she's the one who brought up mesmerism, and Carmilla assertively indicates that Laura herself is a medium. Her dream of meeting Carmilla at 6 years old was a vision of the future where she would meet Carmilla. By implication, Carmilla is a medium who had a vision of herself meeting Laura and biting her, as she would in the future. That they had a shared dream vision. Laura asks if Carmilla wants her to look at the moon. Carmilla lets her decide for herself. Laura chooses to look at the moon. Nothing seems to happen at first, but Carmilla encourages Laura not to give up, telling her not to be afraid. Laura stares at the moon and has a vision. She is a medium. Carmilla was helping her. She sees a chapel and reports to Carmilla that there is a funeral. She sees her father and hears people talking, but can't understand what they're saying. The audience would assume that she's foreseeing her own funeral after Carmilla kills her, but Carmilla, who can also see the vision, gently corrects her. It's not a funeral. Laura realizes that the vision is of a crypt. 3 men, presumably her father, General Spielsdorf, and Baron Fordenberg, pull the stone cover off of a coffin, and Laura catches sight of who's inside. Seeing this figure freaks her out, and she turns away. But Carmilla continues watching. She narrates in song about how the men discover an aged corpse that still looks fresh, half immersed in a pool of blood that fills the coffin. The music reaches a point of high intensity as Carmilla describes Laura's father killing this vampire.
Eyes are open, they test the limbs, find them flexible, the skin elastic, the leaden coffin is coated with cloud in which the body lies half immersed. Now it is raised, a short escape, even through the heart. It serves as a living person, the last agony.
The vision ends. Carmilla explains that though some premonitions come to pass, some are warnings of bad outcomes that mediums can avoid if they consciously choose to change. However, the details of the vision become indistinct now. It was basically a dream that they awoke from. The moon mesmerizes, causes nightmares, and enables visions for mediums, but these 3 effects of odic force aren't discrete. Now, Laura and Carmilla both can't remember who was in the coffin. Carmilla suggests that it could be either of them or someone else. By implication, Laura will probably be a vampire soon. Carmilla advises her to adjust her path to keep from winding up in that situation, and Carmilla will as well. With the threat of death on the horizon, Carmilla muses about how people about to die together may embrace in their final moments. The approach of death reveals how people feel love. The two of them embrace. Laura comments that Carmilla is making her arms go numb. Carmilla asks if Laura wants her to back off, and Laura says no. She wants Carmilla to embrace her tightly. Here, Laura demonstrates actual agency. Carmilla lets her decide if she wants Carmilla's dark, scary sexual dominance, and Laura specifically asks for it. Considering that this was made in 1970, it's a pretty progressive spin on the story. Obliging Laura's request, Carmilla holds her tightly and sings, repeating the line, "Death is dark and unknown, and love is sweet."
Death is dark and unknown, and love is sweet.
She indicates that she has no faith in the afterlife and appreciates love while she's allowed to be on Earth. Again, it's implied that she became a vampire through suicide, in which her last moments had fear of total death. She then repeats the line, "Live by love." And then, it's unclear what happens. The critics had wildly different takes. As far as I can tell, they seemingly embrace and die together, in each other's arms, as lovers may, metaphorically having consensual loving sex. The notes indicate that following the vision, Laura now has agency and makes the free choice to become a vampire and join Carmilla in undeath. But I think it was presented ambiguously, so that the audience might also interpret them as dying normally, taking their chances in the afterlife, or just embracing without any death. They then rise, standing up on stage. The background now looks like the Schloss. Carmilla points out seeing Laura's father inside. They link arms and walk inside as the opera ends. I think it's implied that they then eat Laura's father to keep him from killing them, and then go off to be happy together. But the ambiguity confused a lot of people. One reviewer assumed that it was a metaphor for both of them dying for real and finding each other in heaven, which I think was intentionally telegraphed as a possibility in the ambiguity. Another interpretation could be that they're both crazy and go off to be together as crazy lesbians in an ambiguously positive outcome. In the vampire interpretation, it's as happy an ending as this kind of dark fantasy can have. In the heaven interpretation, it might be a happier ending, implying that God forgave Carmilla for her sins, which has some thematic depth with her rejection of Christianity, not resulting in her being damned, as one might presume. Either way, it makes her line about people being happy to die have thematic weight. Or maybe it's a hallucination, in which case Laura is distressed but has found solace in her fantasy world. It is, as ever, ambiguous. From a feminist perspective, the ending isn't great. The consent element is a decent twist, but Carmilla is still pretty abusive. Or they're in heaven in a just-so-good ending, where Carmilla also doesn't have to do any work to not be abusive. The idea that lesbians must die to be good, or to have their happy ending, is problematic. The use of what we now call the bury your gays trope was even criticized in 1972, when Michael Feingold wrote a scathing review, accusing the directors of hating lesbians, and dubbed the opera La Fenou's Revenge. Feingold wrote, "Gay women are certainly entitled to their happy ending, but we have just spent 12 scenes with a story that is precisely not about gay women, but about blood-sucking nightmares. Contemporary homosexuality, marching through the streets in full force, needs this kind of disguised apologia less than anything." It's a reasonable criticism, and emphasizes that modern criticism along those lines isn't an out-of-touch contrivance of our era. That said, I do think that Feingold approached the opera from a flawed perspective, anticipating it as an imitation of The Vampire Lovers, and not understanding that the opera was originally released about 10 months before that film, which led to a misconception that it was a knockoff of a popular film, instead of a whole other take on a Victorian novella that came about independently. I don't blame him for not having the internet in 1972, but his research gaps do throw off his whole thesis. That said, to describe the opera as a great representation of lesbians would be an exaggeration. Carmilla is still evil, her sexual expression is still horrific, the pedophilic implication is retained in the context of the general public believing that this is what gay people are like. The lesbians both apparently die in the end, or embrace evil, or maybe Laura is just crazy. It is brimming with homophobic tropes. However, Leach and Braswell seem to use this homophobic framework as a means of supporting a relatively progressive portrayal of Laura and Carmilla as sympathetic, lonely figures who genuinely care about each other. Albeit in a toxic relationship, it's not perfect by any means, but it's a stepping stone on the path to better representation. It preceded 1972's Cabaret, the first real example of gay positivity in mainstream cinema, both stemming from the same cultural shifts started by Stonewall. It has a place in the history of LGBT storytelling. When appreciating modern queer-positive versions of Carmilla, it's worth taking a look back on this, the original spin with lesbian progressivism, in Carmilla, A Vampire Tale.
A cruel paradox. Love